Welcome back to Respondent Behavior. This is video part 2. Beginning with Objective 3, define unconditioned reflex response and list types of unconditioned reflexes. And in the prior video part, I introduced you to the unconditioned reflex. So now we're going into detail on the response part of the unconditioned reflex, the unconditioned reflex response. Unconditioned reflex response is a reflex response that's not due to prior learning. Instead, it's due to phylogenetic provenance, which means it's due to natural selection or it's innate. It wasn't learned. The response part of an unconditioned reflex is this unconditioned reflex response. So it is abbreviated as UR. And this is a table borrowed from Jack Michael in 2004. The unconditioned stimulus column is blank because we're going to look at that later. I'm showing you the unconditioned reflex response column first because I want to go through this list. And this is a list of unconditioned reflex responses provided by Jack Michael. And so the first one is an eye blink. So the eye blink is just that your eyelid closes. Then you have the lacrimal gland secretion, which is just your eyes watering. There's also sneezing. Coughing is an unconditioned reflex response. Shivering, also known as surface vasoconstriction. Or sweating, also known as surface vasodilation. The contraction of the tensor tympani and stapedius muscles, so that's just a reduction in the amplitude. Well, it produces a reduction in the amplitude of eardrum vibration, so you can think that as just contraction of muscles in the eardrum. And then salivation, vomiting, the withdrawal of the hand or foot, and then an activation syndrome. So activation syndrome involves a few things, but I think what you can just focus on is that there's an increase in heart rate. You'd also have an increase in the startle response. And there are some other things going on as well, but mainly just think of the activation system as an increase in heart rate, increase in a startle response. And that'll be good enough for our purposes. So Objective 4 is to define unconditioned stimulus and list types of unconditioned stimuli. So now we're focused on the stimulus part of an unconditioned reflex. The unconditioned stimulus is an eliciting stimulus which is not due to prior learning. It is of phylogenetic provenance, so due to natural selection, it's innate. And it's the stimulus part of an unconditioned reflex. And it's abbreviated US. So here are some examples. A puff of air. A puff of air to the eye would be an unconditioned stimulus, and an unconditioned reflex response that it elicits would be the eye blink. A loud sound. A loud sound can be an eliciting stimulus that elicits a startle response. A startle response is a type of reflex response. It's part of the activation syndrome as well. So a loud sound can function as an unconditioned stimulus. Okay. And now that's another thing to consider at this point in the unit, is that we're talking about an unconditioned stimulus, which is the stimulus part of a reflex. We're really talking not so much about the form of the stimulus and its appearance or its physical characteristics, although we are emphasizing that, the puff of air, the loud sound. But also at this time you should be thinking about its function, because when I say that it's if I just said the word stimulus, that doesn't tell you anything about the effect of the change in the environment on behavior. But when I say unconditioned stimulus, I'm specifying that it's an eliciting stimulus. When I say eliciting stimulus, I'm specifying that this stimulus has a particular function or a particular effect on behavior. The stimulus is an antecedent, and the stimulus elicits. So that's the function. What's the function of an unconditioned stimulus? It elicits reflex responses. So a puff of air to the eye has an antecedent respondent function. A loud sound has an antecedent respondent function. They both elicit reflex responses. So smoke in the lungs is also going to be an antecedent stimulus. It's going to be an eliciting stimulus, which means the function of smoke in the lungs is that it elicits the reflex response of coughing. Okay, then sour juice on the tongue can also be an unconditioned stimulus or an eliciting stimulus. A loud crashing sound, the touch of a hot stove burner. Here are some non-examples. So these are not eliciting stimuli, one's own behavior. So your own behavior cannot be an antecedent for other behaviors that you engage in or other aspects of your behavior. Okay, so one's own behavior cannot be an unconditioned stimulus. A tone that elicits salivation is not an unconditioned stimulus because that's not innate. The ability of a tone to elicit a salivation, that function of the tone, would be something that is acquired through experience. That is, it's of ontogenic provenance. So it would be a conditioned stimulus, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so a tone that elicits salivation, that eliciting function would be acquired through experience. It's not a condition. It's not an unconditioned stimulus. The sight of a cockroach elicits the activation syndrome. So the sight of a cockroach is not an unconditioned stimulus. It's due to learning instead. Okay, so now we've filled in the unconditioned stimulus part column of this table. And so I'm showing you now the unconditioned stimulus that can elicit each of the unconditioned responses. So together, for example, in each row, the stimulus in the left column and the response in the right column together form a reflex. Okay, so a loud sound or touch to the cornea is an unconditioned stimulus. What's its function? It elicits the unconditioned reflex response of an eye blink. Okay, so the fact that the loud sound or touch to the cornea reliably and consistently evokes the eye blink means that there's the reliable relation means that together they form a reflex. Okay. Another way to think about this, if you think back to Descartes' observations of the people stepping on the plates in the ground, which moved the statues, the movement of the statue isn't the metaphor for a reflex, or the panel being depressed when the person stepped on it. That's not what Descartes thought of as a reflex. No, it was the relation between the two. Is the fact that the statue never moved unless the plate was depressed, and every single time the plate was depressed, the statue moved. So there was a strong functional relation between the two. So tactile stimulus under your well, I don't know what this is. This might be an error here, but a tactile stimulus or chemical irritant like smoke. Tactile stimulus under the eyelid or chemical irritant, smoke, can elicit the lacrimal gland secretion of eyes watering. Okay, together they're an unconditioned reflex, but this is the unconditioned reflex response, and this is the unconditioned stimulus or eliciting stimulus. Okay, so irritation to the nasal mucosa can elicit sneezing. Irritation to the throat can elicit coughing. Low temperature can elicit shivering. High temperature can elicit sweating. Notice that I'm using the word elicit every time. Okay, I'm not using the word emit or evoke or abate. Those are terms later that we'll distinguish as not appropriate to describe the function of unconditioned stimuli or even conditioned stimuli. Okay, so loud sound elicits contraction of the tensor tympani and the stapedius muscles. Food in the mouth can elicit salivation. Undigestible food in the stomach can elicit vomiting. Painful stimulus to the hand or foot can elicit the hand or foot withdrawal. And a single stimulus that is very painful or very intense or very unusual can elicit the activation syndrome. Now, in the future, when you're trying to determine whether an instance of behavior is respondent or operant, what you'll need to do is you'll need to think back to these unconditioned reflex responses, because respondent behavior is invariant topographically, meaning each time a reflex response occurs, it has the same appearance or form. And we come equipped with a set number of reflex responses, okay? And so later on, when you're looking at examples, if the behavior the person's engaging in is not any of these, then it's very likely that it is not a reflex response. That means it's you're not looking at a reflex, which also means that you're not looking at respondent behavior. Instead, it's something else, which is going to be operant behavior we'll talk about later. Okay, so it's important to memorize this list. Alright, objective 5 is to define elicit and discriminate between examples and non-examples. Elicit is to reliably and consistently evoke a response. And so what I especially don't want you to do is I don't want you to use the word evoke when you're talking about respondent behavior, specifically when you're talking about the effects of unconditioned or conditioned stimuli on respondent behavior, unless you're using it in this definition. If you use it in this definition, that's fine. Because later I'm going to talk with you about how the word evoke refers to a different antecedent function. Okay, so elicit refers to the function of an antecedent in that it elicits a reflex response, okay, or that it momentarily makes a reflex response very likely. Okay. Evoke doesn't have the term evoke does not refer to that function of an antecedent stimulus. So stimuli elicit reflex responses. And elicit is only used to refer to the reliable momentary increase in a reflex response when a stimulus occurs. Elicit cannot be used to refer to behavior affected by consequences. And responses do not elicit stimuli. We use other terms, like a response can produce a stimulus, okay, or result in the occurrence of a stimulus or something like that. But in the case of respondent behavior, we're talking about reflex responses, and reflex responses don't have any effect on the environment. They don't produce consequences that select or influence the future probability of the reflex response. That's not happening with respondent behavior. So responses don't elicit stimuli. Stimuli elicit reflex responses. All right, so this diagram here in R with an arrow to the right followed by an S, that doesn't apply, right? You'd have to flip it. If you're talking about elicit, it's an S with an arrow and an R. That's the correct diagram. Okay, so let's look at examples of the correct use of elicit. The food on the tongue elicited salivation. The sudden loud noise elicited the activation syndrome. Vomiting was elicited by food touching the back of the throat. The smoke elicited coughing. Incorrect uses of elicit are the sound of the airplane elicited looking up at the sky. It's incorrect because looking up at the sky would be a learned behavior that was selected by consequences in the past. In the past, you would have heard an airplane, or someone oriented it to you, or oriented you to it, or you saw something out of the corner of your eye and you looked up and saw an airplane. But looking up at the sky is not a reflex response. And if you refer back to the Jack Michael table that listed those unconditioned reflex responses, you won't see looking up as a reflex response. That'll help you further. That'll really help you distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate, or correct and incorrect uses of elicit. So his behavior elicited a strong reaction from the crowd. Incorrect use of elicit. Stepping on the plate elicited movement in the ancient statue. Now, why can't we use that? Because that, Descartes talked about stepping on, the depression of the plate, moving the statue. But those were inanimate objects. Those weren't, he wasn't talking about a living organism there. And so the word elicit is used to refer to the function of an antecedent stimulus that elicits a reflex response in a living organism. That's what we typically use it for. But we certainly don't use it to refer to things that aren't organisms. Yeah. Now, the politician's speech elicited a riot in the crowd. Incorrect use of elicit. Giving the student a difficult homework assignment elicited noncompliance. No, you can't use it that way. All right, ASR 2. He did the ice bucket challenge, and the ice cold water elicited shivering. Is this the correct use of the word elicit? A, yes, or B, no. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is yeah, definitely. Shivering is a reflex response, and that rapid change in temperature would be an unconditioned stimulus that would elicit that reflex response. So this is the correct word, elicit. You can use, by using the word elicit, we're specifying that the ice-cold water had the antecedent respondent function of making shivering very highly likely to occur at that very moment. ASR 3. The beautiful painting elicited a surprising reaction from the crowd. Is this the correct use of the word elicit? A, yes, B, no. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. The answer here is B, no. ASR 4, the pitcher threw the ball, which elicited the swing of the bat. Is this the correct use of the word elicit? A, yes, B, no. Give it a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is B, no. ASR 5, during the little girl's feeding therapy, the salty cracker elicited gagging. Is this the correct use of the word elicit? A, yes, B, no. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is A, yes. Gagging would be a reflex response. Alright, that wraps up this video part. I'll see you in the next video part, beginning with Objective 6.